cute. Very cute. I need to shut up.
When Watch Dogs 2 launched back in 2016, it was a complete tonal shift from its gritty predecessor. The first game was criticised for a multitude of things, being too buggy, too downgraded, too laser focused on a revenge story, and the hacking was dismissed as a secondary gimmick to what has been referred to online by the masses as a John Wick simulator. I don't think that's the greatest description I've ever heard, as it's not really that tongue-in-cheek, but I agree with the sentiment that it was an action thriller first and hacking game second. Watch Dogs 2 sought to rectify a load of these issues. The game is no longer focused on a dark, vengeful story, opting for a story about a group of vegans playing whimsical pranks on major corporations while possibly committing acts of domestic terror in the meantime that never go addressed. The hacking is no longer a secondary aspect to a bog-standard third-person shooter. Now, it was at the forefront. The hacking became a true sandbox that opened up the Watch Dogs gameplay loop exponentially. But these changes didn't come without their own flaws. Watch Dogs 2 was an odd game. I remember distinctly playing it back in 2016 when it was new and trailing off it because I found it to be so unbelievably jarring. I couldn't wrap my head around who in their right minds could possibly believe playing as a band of hippies flicking big tech on the nose was somehow a better premise than a gritty action thriller like the first game. I put the game down and kind of forgot about it. At least until now. I've returned to hope to come to understand Watch Dogs 2 for what it is, not in a vacuum where I don't compare it to its predecessor, but certainly to appreciate what it has to offer, as that's not something I've ever truly done. It's a game with so much going for it. It may not have the strongest story or characters, and it may suffer from a high risk of tonal whiplash if you play it blind, but this is a game where you can drive a scissor lift down the street just because, where you can crush yourself with a crane, where you can become God's most unhinged Uber driver, or simply soak in a highly immersive realization of San Francisco, while committing dastardly crimes against fashion. So, I ponder this question: is Watch Dogs 2 better than I ever gave it credit? Can the positives it offers outweigh the horrific death I feel slivers of my soul suffering every time one of the trooper protagonists opens their damn mouths? Some people seem to think so, others don't. This is one of those Marmite games. You hardly ever hear somebody say, it was alright. So, does Watch Dogs 2 actually have something worthwhile to offer, or is it just the meat in a franchise-wide identity crisis sandwich? Let's find out. So before we plumb the depths of Watch Dogs 2's existence, we need to look at the game that preceded it. Watch Dogs was criticised heavily for its approach. I mean, the main issues with the game at launch back in 2014 were the bugs, the poor optimization, the graphical downgrades from promotional material, and the limited nature of the hacking element to the game being pressing a button to do a thing or choosing not to do that. And that's kind of the extent of your options outside of mass hacks. It wasn't so narrow as to be jarring, but it was more limited than it could have been. Overall, I like Watch Dogs a lot, but critiques understandably spilled over into narrative territory. To many, Aiden Pearce's character wasn't viewed as likeable, and I can see why. The somber tone of his pessimistic life as he embarked on a one-man revenge mission against the mob for the death of his innocent niece. You can't like him because he probably doesn't like himself all that much, but above all else, the narrative didn't feel all that original. It was a hard sell for a game that promised to do something different, because it oddly fell back on quite a safe story. Something reliable, done before, done elsewhere, much better. You can see why it wasn't the best received plot in the world. I like huge elements of it. I like the idea of vengeance as a driving force in a narrative like this, but it is ironically quite dull when you stack it against the blood-pumping tight action it encourages, because it's an easy hook. That's got to be frustrating from a game that at first appears to offer something unique, only for it to become secondary to the storytelling that really isn't. For a narrative establishing a new franchise, it wasn't overall the strongest, and many believed Watch Dogs 2 needed a departure from this. I'm inclined to agree somewhat, but not fully. It did need to do something that encompassed the establishment of its own world to a more satisfying degree. It needed to put the gameplay's hacking element to the storytelling forefront in ways that Watch Dogs 1 often didn't. It was there, but it was far from a crucial element. The technological age on display was an over-reliant one. CTOS, this interconnected city concept, proved ultimately to be a means to an end in a plot that had other priorities and could have functioned without it. So the sequel absolutely needed to bring more focus to what makes Watch Dogs its own thing. Perhaps a less personally driven storyline with more cavalier beats was exactly what the series needed, to a point. So, no longer are we gracing the windy streets of somber Chicago, we're transported to the sunny city of San Francisco, where we play not as a jaded vigilante, but a disenfranchised young adult named Marcus Holloway, who was convicted of a crime he didn't do because an algorithm flagged him as high risk. Now he's out to expose the system for the corrupt mess that it is by doing crimes and being a high risk. That's not a dig at hypocrisy, by the way, that's just a self-fulfilling prophecy. Marcus is a genius hacker, an expert at parkour, capable with a taser, proficient with firearms as suggested by his registered gun ownership and the ability to send people to God should you choose to play that way. He's a new recruit to DedSec, a shadowy organisation featured in the first game, but in San Francisco we're introduced to a very distinct cell. They communicate through over-edited videos, graffiti and art. Marcus, alongside his newfound friends Sitara, Josh, Horatio and a guy in a mask named Wrench, whom nobody who likes this series seems to ever shut up about, embark on a journey to expose Bloom, the creators of CTOS, for their abuses of the power creating an interconnected world has granted them, along with their corporate and governmental bedfellows. Our main antagonist, a man-bun-rocking fitness freak named Dushan Nemec, who functions as the chief technology officer of Bloom, the man behind CTOS 2.0. Now, to say I dislike these characters would be a bit strong, but they aren't written all that well if you ask me. We get some basic motivations as to why they're doing this, but they never really develop as people. We don't discover anything really all that groundbreaking aside from maybe Wrench's birthmark. Their humour is also very hard to gel with, but there's something oddly human about making jests that don't always land. Does it make them less annoying? No. Their inability to take their hacktivist work seriously at first is endearing, but towards the back end of the story, it becomes a frustrating crutch as the stakes ramp up. Their humour starts to manifest as a backdoor to not take anything in this game too seriously, and I think that was a mistake. As for Dushan, he shows up a few times, he seems critically self-aware that he is in fact the villain, and that makes him harder to appreciate, especially considering the very plausible central issue the game is tackling. This is a man without good intentions, he's just a bad guy doing bad things for totalitarian world domination. It creates a black and white morality where one doesn't need to be present. It grossly oversimplifies a complex beast for the sake of an easy following. Sure, he's basically a hodgepodge of every bad actor who might misuse your data in the real world, but I believe a crucial aspect of this sort of digital monstrosity is the fact that it was born out of good intentions that got misguided and diluted. That makes for a far more compelling concept for how to frame an antagonist at the head of such a mess. The story from here is a bit scattered, especially for the first half. You just sort of mooch off and take on a target, rinse repeat until the narrative gets into gear. And the reason why it's taking so long is we're building an online following. This is just a disguised XP system, but okay. So as a result of the XP system being disguised as a follower count, we find ourselves rolling from one series of events to another. We face various corporations, Noodle, Tidus, Galilei, gangs, the FBI. There's a lot of orbiting in this plot, and it's actually quite hard to recall anything about it that felt special. We have a series of uniquely presented characters who don't develop from their starting point. Aside from Horatio, he kind of dies. That is a development, I suppose. But you get the sense that at times the story is avoiding developing purely because it has to go to darker places than its start point. It's trying to make a point out of not being Watch Dogs, to the point where it doesn't necessarily adequately explore itself. Does it have moments that are supposed to be impactful? Naturally, but what stops them from being impactful is the fact that none of these characters are on a journey of any kind. They're just chilling in a basement, hacking, while Marcus is out committing acts of domestic terror. That makes it ultimately far from memorable. You see, the story is what it is. Where the distinction in direction is felt the most, however, is the gameplay. If you choose to embrace it anyhow. You see, you can play this game as a chaotic rampage if you really wish to. You truly can go guns blazing all the time and reap the consequences of a disconnected story where Marcus's insane killing sprees are never addressed. But the combat has been adjusted to be a touch harder than its predecessor. Enemy AI opt to flank you more often. Being detected can result in reinforcements repeatedly being called, causing a game of whack-a-mole but with unregistered 3D printed firearms. The natural solution is to resort to stealth gameplay, which makes sense for a guy who is not coming from a hardened criminal past like Aiden Pierce. We have no reason to believe that Marcus is, for even a moment, a cold-blooded killer, so naturally we're constantly given non-lethal options. Watch Dogs 2 boasts many gameplay benefits over the first game. The hacking is far more open with multiple options for each hackable object. You can set a trap, have it spring only when an enemy is standing near it, have it automatically go off as a distraction. You can hack cars to make them move in multiple directions, or indeed to simply shift out of the way if they're being used as cover. You have more tools to achieve your goals. The RC car allows you to gain access to ventilation shafts. The quadcopter gives you a moving aerial view of your environment, and both of these methods can allow you to slip into and out of restricted areas without ever having to set foot within. They also resolve the obstructive nature of having to utilise what lays within the line of sight. Hacking overall in Watch Dogs 2 is significantly more expansive, and the options are considerably more varied. On this note alone, depth opens up exponentially. The driving has been revamped. I don't actually think it's any better. I think finding a way to make game driving feel like anything but a mode of transport from A to B is a big ask, so I don't typically worry too much about it. The cars are responsive, fairly easy to control, albeit they're quite notchy. I also don't understand the logic of being able to hack a nitrous boost into the cars. Either way, that's a cool perk that increases acceleration, but if you use it while the car's at the max speed, I have a sneaky suspicion it only makes the screen shakier. Police AI is smarter, they patrol more frequently, get involved in affairs unaffiliated with us, and we can summon them to cause distractions quite easily too. Otherwise, bog standard open world game with driving police system. And otherwise driving. What else do you want me to say about that? For stealth, we also have a series of new tools. A taser for quick takedowns that last a few minutes, meaning they aren't a permanent fix to an enemy being present. A melee weapon that amounts to a pool ball on a rope. It has that homemade vibe. I suppose it's not as clean to use as Aiden's baton, but it's handy. I prefer the baton. And we're somehow supposed to believe that braining somebody at the speed of sound with this thing is non-lethal. But blunt force trauma to the head in fiction, particularly when inflicted by a person, is hardly ever depicted as fatal, despite being very possible in the real world, so we just have to accept that one. We also have stun bombs we can deploy wherever. They craft themselves on a cooldown in our pockets. I can't fathom the logic for it, but hey, for gameplay purposes, it's kinda handy to have this self-replenishing supply of bombs, especially when we can use them in tandem with the hacking to dictate how they behave. This is a game that pushes the player to make use of the environment, plan traps, to analyse patrol patterns with the net hack, which functions as this game's eagle vision or focus mode equivalent mechanic, or indeed to create distractions and seize opportunities to slip by unnoticed, whether in person or remotely via RC car. We are not instructed to follow such a playstyle, but the game clearly leans heavily towards it, towards making us stealthy, quiet and clean. When Marcus is detected, he feels exposed. If in the wrong situation, he can die quickly, so the stealth is the default mode and should only ever be broken when absolutely necessary, or at least that's the game's intention. The reality is, if you're detected by one enemy, if only for a split second, it feels like half of San Francisco knows exactly where you are, and they're coming for all the money you've siphoned from their bank accounts. Blanket detection is a pretty good way to drive the stake of unreliability firmly through its core. It makes the stealth arduous, tedious to cling to even, and most casual players will roll with the punches of gameplay rather than waiting to die and resetting, because often the combat works too well. It's an equally viable approach despite its new challenges. This is where the disconnect creeps in. The combat doesn't offer much in the way of new features, though the handy focus mode from the first game is understandably missing. Marcus is no expert combatant unlike Aiden, so what Aiden could do, Marcus can't. That's natural. It does offer some new features, though most that stick to the non-lethal nature that complements the storytelling best were sold in DLC if I'm not mistaken, so you're shit out of luck if you don't feel like paying twice just to enjoy a more brazen playstyle that fits. The enemy variety isn't any more vast than the first game either. It's a non-issue when the gameplay is clearly oriented towards your objective laying beyond your enemies rather than through them, with the exception of dogs of course. Those are new. Usually you have to tase them, shoot them, or 8-ball them to death. And that makes me sad, but they're not real, so they can fuck off. The enemy variety that there is besides is quite interesting considering the stealthy setup. Certain enemy archetypes need to be taken down up close and personal for stealth to be maintained. If they're armoured, they're perfectly happy to take a taser to the face or a stun bomb to the kneecaps, so you have to get up close and thunderball them unless you're confident you can slap them with 2 taser shots in rapid succession. Animations also get inconsistent here. Some are quick, some are slow. Some draw you out of cover with how Marcus moves during the animation that plays when such takedowns are initiated, so it's a lucky dip as to how risky you can successfully be. This also applies to a lesser extent to parkour animations. Sure, they look great. In low pressure situations, Marcus's flips and tricks are incredibly satisfying to watch, but throw them into a braver, fast-paced stealth approach, and the animation lengths can get a bit inconsistent, with Marcus pausing for a moment for fancy flips. And there's no real added functional value over Aiden's parkour in the first game, aside from maybe being able to hop from one thing to another, so it just becomes about looking cool. I can take that, but it simply is the case that in clutch moments we're relying on the animation lucky dip. And that takes the sting out of making stealth exhilarating somewhat, not to mention other high intensity gameplay moments. Because while unpredictability to a point is exciting, it's really hard to push a stealth system to its limits when its limits are determined by the game's randomness. I'll dive more into the gameplay not interacting well with the story later, but for now I'll say that Watch Dogs 2's gameplay is quite juxtaposed. It wants you to be stealthy, but stealth is sometimes overwhelming to cling to. When it works beautifully, but it's only ever the game's randomness away from breaking. Your mistakes are penalised excessively, and then the combat is balanced to drive you back towards stealth when de-escalation, though possible, is unpredictable and too slow to rely upon. The game functions best when you just roll with it. Use stealth to begin with, and if the situation escalates to combat, just fight for your life. That doesn't feel like the way the game should be played based on the story, but based on the gameplay itself, I'd argue it's exactly how the game should be played for the sake of your sanity. Most missions are quite open, accounting for a variety of approaches, and that's great. It makes the default options of a more linearly constructed mission setup more bland, and thus you have the intelligence to tap into your own creativity when presented with such a wealth of tools. You can really come into your own here. The downside, of course, is missions often have a muck layout and can rely on the story content to be unique. With a story that feels like it's teetering from one injustice to another in a spoof anonymous greatest hits tour, it's really going to be a conscious thing many will have to keep track of personally. And every so often, for deeper narrative moments, you're going to have to break from the muck layout, and that can be incredibly annoying when you were expecting one. The fact there's so much variety in the gameplay makes it incredibly frustrating that it doesn't try and draw out complacent players to try new things. You have some easy methods that are overpowered. Distracts such as buzzing an enemy's phone completely destroys their spatial awareness, so you can charge at them and close the gap before they even acknowledge you're there, as just one example. If we have tools we know work too well all the time, why will we keep experimenting with things that might be a tad riskier? The fact that some stealth aspects are reliable does not mean that the broader stealth gameplay is overall reliable. There are moments where the flow of gameplay breaks itself down. For instance, mission objectives where you must set up ambushes. You can plan as meticulously as possible. The situation may end up looking vastly different to the preview we're provided via the net hack, and that's annoying. I find the vehicles often plod themselves in different positions and enemies move to places the game tells us they aren't going to be. I don't get what the ambush mechanic is for if our traps heavily rely on information that's false. I think it's the explosive charges that break it, but those are small and shouldn't be so easily clocked, and aren't in other aspects of gameplay often, so it's weird. Overall, I don't find Watch Dogs 2's stealth challenging, or even to be, in my opinion, bad gameplay. It's great fun, but things don't quite tick on like they should all the time. What you know works too well. What you experiment with can at times be incredibly unpredictable. Sometimes it'll work, sometimes it won't, and sometimes that variable is outside the player's control. That makes planning for remaining undetected a mixed bag, yet when it works properly, things feel right. It doesn't feel like the kind of game that leans towards a playstyle at all. You have an array of tools, some stealthy, some loud, some lethal, some non-lethal, and it's up to the player largely to decipher that the canon approach is to not kill people above all else. Now, I won't pretend the stealth doesn't have the depth to stand on its own 2 feet just fine, but the non-lethal gameplay especially did need more distinction as the correct choice. We have an array of tools to use here. We can expand that arsenal with paid DLC if you're a sucker, and what we have isn't lackluster by any means. However, the failure to distinguish it meaningfully, as in whatever you do the story progresses exactly the same, it doesn't matter, allows the gameplay to feel detached from the narrative and the delivery of the very world itself. Watch Dogs 1 had many flaws, but it thrived as an action thriller. It was stupidly fun to be a one-man tank taking on the mob. The gameplay complemented the vibe it was aiming for in its storytelling nicely. A lot of that gameplay is left over here, and that comprises the bulk of open combat, with some slight tweaks to challenge to discourage it. Marginally. But that loud and proud gameplay doesn't complement the story well. The simple solution, not use it. But that puts the onus of the game's integrity on the player and not the game. Therefore, there's a whopping disconnect that a casual player will very easily stumble into. You can go on a warpath, you can keep moving and be highly aggressive. The game makes your life more difficult if you try, but it's not just possible. It's plausible as a playstyle. The fact we're supposed to feel Marcus is at a greater disadvantage in open conflict should discourage us from engaging with the conflict, but because that doesn't automatically mean that engaging in open conflict is going to result in Marcus dying. It can actually become quite satisfying to find ways to make it highly reliable. You just need to find a cozy corner, keep yourself covered and work your way out. Gunplay in Watch Dogs 2 isn't designed to be the most fun, expansive facet of the experience, and it doesn't need to be. The whole point of a gun is it takes the fuss out of a violent encounter. Who shoots first? Who gets shot first? Game over, rinse, repeat. There are only so many ways one can reinvent that wheel, no matter how expansive your arsenal is or how much variety in enemy archetypes, or even lack thereof, you throw at us. The fact of the matter is we don't have any overpowered abilities in combat. Marcus feels fragile. He feels exposed. We only have our wits and whatever weapons we have to hand when it kicks off. But once you've got a bearing on the combat, you keep moving, you play aggressively. You either find yourself a corner and thin the herd, or you choose where you instigate your fight. It can be incredibly satisfying to pull off. I find it much more reliable to predict than the stealth, and as a result, getting a bearing for your limits in the combat is actually far more rewarding than doing the same for the stealth that is far more expansive. Because if you choose the combat, the game pushes you towards those limits, whereas in stealth it prioritizes making you aware of what's easy and simple, when there's so much more complexity that's screaming to be observed. The game doesn't really do a great job at promoting the depth to convince you to cling to a stealthy, non-lethal playstyle. It doesn't lack the depth, it just pushes you to explore the limits of what isn't the deepest facet of gameplay, and as a result the player will roll with whatever works on a case-by-case basis. Maybe on a second or third run you might start restricting yourself, and if that's you, all the power to you. But while the storytelling is comedic and light-hearted, this group of nerdy hacktivists have the potential to become passengers endorsing Marcus's reign of terror and destruction. And the game has no method for keeping our approach in check, no penalties for being too destructive. Even Watch Dogs 1, where the violence was far more at home, had this. A morality system, though it only really meant you'd be recognised and pursued if your reputation was low, was still a way in which the game actively policed the player into not just doing what they want for the sake of it. Here, it doesn't matter who you're killing, provided you can flee from the authorities, the world doesn't adjust to reflect your approach. You don't have to pay any mind to who gets caught in the crossfire. You don't even need such an excuse for collateral damage. You can outright call mob hits on random members of the public. It's a weird feature and it's obviously intended for use against fellow gangsters so that Marcus can create gang warfare between either two factions or one faction and the police to serve as something of a distraction, but the fact it can be haplessly deployed to no consequence is quite amusing more than anything. As you can tell, this isn't just about deploying combat or being lethal. This problem runs further. We don't even have to be the one pulling the trigger to directly cause deaths. The mob hits feature is a testament to that. Is that something Marcus can live with no matter who it is we're killing or having killed? He's too upbeat, too chill, too juvenile if that's the right word. He doesn't have that edge Aiden Pierce had that allowed us to believe he would pragmatically approach his confrontations with ruthlessness and aggression, if that was ultimately the best option. Marcus is a character for whom it makes sense to find alternative solutions, create distractions, avoid the line of sight, use tools to avoid being in danger in the first place, and above all else, avoid killing. Hence the hacking element has advanced so much to account for that. But the point stands, the game really doesn't seem to give two hoots how you go about your hacktivist duties. Do you want to rack up a pile of bodies as high as the Golden Gate Bridge? Knock yourself out. You want to exploit the system to steal from people's bank accounts? Go ahead. This homeless person has $49 from an income that amounts to being exploited by pharmaceutical companies. Take it. This homeless person is at rock bottom. Steal their money. Order a mob hit on them. God forbid Marcus ever finds a single mother. Are we supposed to believe that we're the good guys? None of this has any impact on the story either way, because it's obviously not canon. Not even so much as a passing mention that Marcus is an utter lunatic. If you choose to play the game wrong, the game won't tell you. It'll let you do it. I get it's all in the name of player choice, but there comes a point where it works against the experience's integrity because the game is so sparse on methods to bring the player's attention to the correct approach outside a growing schism between gameplay and storytelling, and if one of those is manifesting, it's usually because the game isn't doing enough to keep you on rails or make you aware of where those rails are. The problem won't manifest if you somehow magically understood from the first mission that you had to play the quiet and clean methods, but I don't think that really promotes a cohesive experience. Let's say you avoided all marketing material for the game, you fired it up and you just played it not knowing what to expect. Would you reasonably be expected to just know what the game wants you to do if it doesn't have the slightest method outside a growing schism between gameplay and storytelling to communicate that you might be playing it wrong? How much of the storytelling is cheapened by that point? The experience no longer gels and you either adjust to it or you dismiss it. Even then, if you do adjust, there are some missions that still stick out like a sore thumb. Running around a test facility in control of a weaponized spider bot killing security personnel. Wrench taking on an entire compound of guards with a grenade launcher. Even if you do this stealthily, the dude blows the place up afterwards anyway. Are we truly to believe, even in story-constructed scenarios, that this group of people haven't got a single drop of blood on their hands? Many of the missions pertain to recklessly endangering the public besides. This form of DedSec can teeter from optimistic activists to an outright domestic terror cell, and that is jarring. And it's not all on the gameplay. The aspect of banality to the issues of this world that makes San Francisco feel so real also hamper the storytelling somewhat, because the story then begins to casually impose artificial limitations on what you can reconcile within gameplay. We have a wealth of tools, many of which are too murder-oriented for us to rationally believe Marcus would actually use, and the only reason I know this is because I used them and noticed the disconnect. Imagine a Batman game where we had the option to whip out a gun and start killing thugs. It'd be weird and infinitely more extreme than anything Watch Dogs 2 does, but you get why presenting the option sometimes isn't necessarily the best way to uphold your game's integrity. Here we have the options. The story refuses to account for them, and sometimes it's just the easiest, lowest effort approach, and as you get to the back end of the game, that gets increasingly tempting. Stealth scenario after stealth scenario where the ante is constantly upped does wear your investment down a bit, so you naturally look for means to switch it up. The plot never proposes the idea that killing is wrong in the main content, so I wouldn't say it's dissonant in the sense that the plot opposes what we can very easily do throughout the whole game if we want to go nuts, but it's very hard to view this version of DedSec the way the game wants us to view them. As the heroes of the story, as the liberators, as champions of the people, when we can easily and readily depopulate San Francisco like there's no tomorrow, when we're not too busy stealing from ordinary working citizens, or ordering mob hits on the homeless for fun.
Let's move!
The only time this becomes a direct conflict is during the Zodiac Killer side mission where Marcus and the gang are hunting a copycat Zodiac Killer. Why, of course, Ubisoft wouldn't take us to San Francisco without tapping into that dark chapter. Upon finding the guy, he calls Marcus his kindred spirit and blows himself up. Marcus is noticeably disgusted afterwards, but depending on how you opt to play the game, Marcus may be a far worse serial murderer than even the original Zodiac, so it's really hard to take seriously. Yes, Marcus, why don't you order mob hits on the public to make yourself feel better? Ultimately, it's within our choosing to do all this for the most part, but there are no repercussions or adjustments to anything outside that moment that try to wrangle us in, bring us back in line with the experience the game wants us to be having. The game doesn't play with regard for its own integrity. The game should be the foremost defender of this, not the player. I mean, ultimately the player should have some variety and options, but all of them should make sense with respect to the story being told. If the story won't adjust itself for lethal playstyles, the game shouldn't have lethal means. This isn't a criticism of having the combat and allowing us to turn things into a bloodbath. It's a simple statement that maybe the light-hearted hacktivist vibes approach really wasn't the most encompassing for what would also make for a fun game. Because you know for a fact people would complain if they couldn't use guns. As things stand, the only real sense of reward outside progression itself is the XP system they've cleverly disguised as a follower bar. This follower count will go up if you complete missions, but it doesn't matter how you do them. Maybe there should have been some bonuses for stealthy and non-lethal approaches alongside penalties for violence, just as one idea as to how Watch Dogs 2 could have implemented some preference for what it wants us to believe is the canon approach. Maybe the game could have benefited from a reputation system like the first one that kept us in check even in a setup where such bloodbaths were believable. We weren't unleashed on the world just to go nuts even there. Here, we kind of are. And in this setup, I can't understand why an arsenal of 3D printed weapons took priority over allowing the player to crouch at will, to hide the unconscious bodies of those being incapacitated, giving us more handy gadgets and non-lethal tools. Rather than seeking means to make the stealth gameplay more interesting and more dynamic, they left in and out for those who simply can't be bothered. And if you opt for that out, it ends up pushing you to your limits far more than the stealth actually does, so it ends up becoming quite immediately gratifying if nothing else, even though engaging with it at all contravenes the premise of being a member of a group of young hackers who we cannot possibly believe would reasonably agree to such an onslaught. I don't think the game was intended to feel so tonally inconsistent, but it is because it puts the onus on the player to seek out the canon approach, even if it offers us nothing to make that added challenge worthwhile. Because it isn't a challenge of skill. I mean, there's certainly enough of that in the hacking element, I don't wish to downplay that. It's more so a challenge of patience though. Should it be viewed as worthwhile within itself? Naturally. But if you're rewarded with progression for simply treating the game like a third-person shooter, and largely bypassing all the options the gameplay has to offer, players are equipped to reach the end point on a much shorter route, and many will take it because it's the path of least resistance, or at least the path where the resistance is the most predictable. I've seen online discussions where people claim the game discourages the combat, but in my opinion it really doesn't. It encourages it, if anything. Yeah, we don't have a focus mode where time slows down, and Marcus can't handle as many hits, but actively making the gunplay less unnecessarily convenient isn't the same as actively pushing the player towards less violent solutions. If anything, removing the overpowered focus mode makes the gunplay more enticing because it's harder by default. You have to be creative even here. You have no easy overpowered abilities that will allow you to get out of a bind. The blanket detection that can unravel any stealth attempt also pushes you towards the combat. I've also seen people say that religiously clinging to the stealthy non-lethal playstyle eliminates the issue, and I'd be inclined to agree. The player can resolve the disconnect that way, but like I said, I think the game should care about its own integrity more than the player does. I also believe that a game that doesn't naturally guide you towards its preference in actionable ways doesn't have a preference at all. And all this nonsense about the non-lethal approach being the canon one was just a cop-out to cause arguments online among players when the disconnect is noticed, so that any genuine critiques got lost in the shuffle. Ubisoft are masters at that, by the way. This is not the first time they've done it, it's certainly not the last. Sometimes Watch Dogs 2 fails to make its good options enticing, or its variation feel necessary. With the straightforward option being so countering to the game's narrative, that's a huge problem at the heart of this game. There's no getting around that. I won't, however, let that, for even a moment, prevent me from talking about the thing this game excels at. Its world. The sunny city of San Francisco, Silicon Valley, Oakland, Alcatraz. Watch Dogs 2's world feels alive. The NPCs don't just endlessly wander, they partake in activities. They're attached to vehicles, and if you steal them, they might notice. They have names, salaries, jobs, hobbies, secrets, according to the profiler, and we're given the privilege to see that. And when your most inconsequential characters have names and lives, even if it is all none of our actual business and presented superficially, even if it is a gross violation of privacy, something rather immersive happens. We stop and we think. We picture all the people we pass in our lives whom we don't know. We consider things we never considered before. Everybody does have all these things, names, interests, jobs, hopefully, and secrets that we will simply never know. Props to the Watch Dogs games for humanizing irrelevant NPCs because it's a fine detail. As we explore this city, we see NPCs engage in location-specific behaviors, tourists at landmarks, weddings at picturesque sites, joggers in parks, sunbathing at the beach, simply walking their pets. I love this game's variety in dogs. I find it hard to praise any game for allowing us to pet dogs, as it was kind of a craze back in 2016, but it's a cool feature, and the sheer range of breeds we can happen upon makes this world feel real.
What do you think about the current state of affairs?
I just wish the German Shepherds were on average friendlier. Watch Dogs 2's open world is a fantastic thing, especially at convincing us it's a real place. Why else would we be allowed to engage in behaviours that don't benefit anything? We can grab a coffee from a cafe, or grip some booze from a bar. We can drive a sailboat even though it never manifests as practical. We can take selfies because we're a pesky millennial. We can stop and soak in street performances such as busking or this golden fellow. We can engage in the endless pit of embarrassing customization. We can also hop on the trolley and have it transport us around the city, and that's great. The police engage in entanglements that you might not be involved in. You can see characters getting arrested. Hell, you can get characters arrested. Then you can hack the vehicle they're put in and drive it straight into the sea. Creative murder. There are factions that enter conflict. We can spy on people's text messages. We can eavesdrop on their phone calls. This digital version of San Francisco has so much to offer. The content that accents this world is also quite enjoyable. Since Marcus isn't a brooding vigilante, it makes sense for him to engage in more fun activities. E-kart racing is by the by. Who doesn't love a bit of racing? Drone racing is alright, though I can barely see the point. Moonlighting as an Uber driver with the Driver San Francisco app isn't just an immersive feature, provided you don't have one of those insane passengers who desperately wants to die for clout. It's a fantastic nod to another game. We're even rewarded with a following if we take selfies or photographs of iconic landmarks like the Golden Gate Bridge. We can deface the Golden Gate Bridge. Oh god. I also have a liking for a lot of the side missions on offer. Hacking ATM machines and messing with people's bank balances is funny. I get that we're supposed to give them money at the expense of an evil corporation, but we can also mess with them the other way and donate to charities from their bank balances or flag them for fraud, which is enticing given how some of them behave. We can hunt the Zodiac Killer, that's always a fun mission. I don't know what to make of hacking into Sitara's cousin's livestream and humiliating her to teach her a lesson. I get the message, one must be cautious online, but it still felt a bit callous, albeit disguised in such a casual demeanour. But hacking a swatter and giving him a taste of his own medicine, for instance, felt satisfying. Aiding Aiden Pierce, albeit briefly, we get to see the Fox is still going strong, and the game doesn't bastardize his character. As for the default mission, that would have been cool if default was actually in it. Hacking Ubisoft to leak an unannounced game. It's not a real game, that would be too self-aware. But it's cool. Other side missions often pertain to aiding those shafted by the system, and that keeps it topical. There are even some hard-hitting discoveries awaiting in this world. I don't know if that makes the narrative basis that facilitates it all even more jarring, as it is often reluctant to delve into grey territory, despite often being there anyway, whether it likes it or not. Or if the upbeat approach allows for us to view the world casually, and that does have some value. This isn't a world characterised by some action thriller at its centre. It isn't artificially constructed to facilitate madness, nor is it there to be too serious. It is there to simply be, and that benefits what makes the world stand out. The map is basically the universe's equivalent to Google Maps. The menu's interfacing with the phone makes everything something Marcus is seeing. We're embedded in the world. The HUD isn't the nicest thing to look at in the world, but it serves its function, and little more, and that's fitting for the idea that Marcus can somehow see it himself. The casual delivery also allows us to view the world in a similar way. The corporations we're fighting against are giants that, to the average consumer, just sell products or produce apps. They offer conveniences for your average individual, and you can see how they've amassed such power so passively. You see, there are some horrific injustices going on under the surface, but Watch Dogs 2 isn't attempting to highlight a dystopia. Rather, it's trying to mirror reality, or at least an alternate version of reality circa 2016, where life is largely unchanged for most people. Ordinary individuals go about their daily lives. Are they affected by the system that oppresses them so passively? Yes. Are they aware of it? No. Welcome to the digital age. We, in our world now, live amongst algorithms. Our social media activity, the content we watch on YouTube, the things we Google. How we spend our time online dictates what these algorithms feed us. Why? Our data. Our activity is logged, and then we're fed ads and content the algorithms think will appeal most to us. It influences our decision making, our spending habits. It makes us aware of conveniences it can offer that might help us, but also those behind the service. The point, of course, is we are being manipulated, digitally harvested even, and we accept it readily because it's handy. Our data is sold, there's no telling whose databases we're on, who's buying our information. who's selling it to begin with. We agree to weigh our digital footprint as a currency in exchange for convenience so passively that many people don't even realise they're doing it, and whomever is paying could theoretically use that for a multitude of purposes where precious few will actually benefit us. This is a dark truth Watch Dogs 2's easygoing tone allows us to explore in a reasonably low stress environment, because low stress is the point. Life is convenient, things work, nobody truly cares how they do, as our man-bun rocking largely absent antagonist tells us, only that it does. But who is equipped to benefit the most from all this? It can't be us. We're still working jobs we might not enjoy, often being paid the lowest possible figure and working to survive, in many cases every single week. Is that the better life? It's the corporations to whom our living is becoming increasingly beholden that rake the profits off of shifting our data to the highest bidder. The individual's best interest isn't even a part of the equation. The data falls into the wrong hands all the time. Your identity could be snatched from you at a moment's notice and used for illegal purposes. Most people are a part of that twisted lottery, hoping this horror doesn't happen to them. Yet many of us wantonly sign up for shit we don't need because it offers a smidgen of convenience and claim we've got nothing to hide. Watch Dogs 2 proposes a world where this rampant online machine is working against ordinary people in ways so subtle that many still can't realise it. Mass surveillance, information people aren't volunteering, readily available when taking out insurance or loans, organisations using the data available on people to manipulate and pacify them, to allow the madness to continue. Watch Dogs 2 does a great job at showcasing how casually the significance of an individual can become eclipsed by the value of their own data, how subconsciously most people allow injustices to ramp up, because it's not all that different to how vulnerable our data-driven modern reality is. The game does well to present a largely normal world, one where the corporations perhaps try to be relatable. In the one mission where we infiltrate Noodle, the game's stand-in for Google, we're met with colourful offices packed with slides. It looks like a fun place to call work, but of course, for Horatio it's made unpleasant by his colleague, who has it in for him. Granted, he is up to suspicious activity. However, we're supposed to believe the happy aesthetic is a disguise for a toxic workplace, one just as soulless as any grey, featureless building. The interconnected hackable city where everything is online may be a fantasy, but the notion of everyone being online and at the mercy of corporations with agendas isn't. That is very relevant to us. I don't think Watch Dogs 2 truly had the grit to go to all the dark corners it needed. It had the upbeat core, but it could have ventured from that safety to the darker realities of our increasingly modernising world. As things stand, the game offers optimism in absence of actually resolving anything, or at least proposing resolution. It's a fun world. It's fantastic to soak in. I'd argue San Francisco feels so alive it puts GTA 5's Los Santos straight to shame. But its commentary never comes full circle. It never quite makes it out from under the positive facade that suits it so well. It's like Watch Dogs 2 is half of what it should be. The immersive world complements the upbeat approach to tone, but the tone feels like it's missing crucial variety that can make exploring the darker aspect to the societal issue it's confronting hit harder. It needed to balance its lightheartedness with plentiful dark, deep, impactful moments that allow us to think more about its chosen subject. This could easily have been used to justify the entire wealth of gameplay, allow the player true freedom to embrace whichever playstyle suited them best, because the narrative would account for Marcus's approach getting more pragmatic. As the plot throws us so deep into the topic, we can no longer rationalise which way was up in relation to a character experiencing the same thing. Watch Dogs 2 identifies a strong starting point. Its problem is it ultimately stays there. The tone hardly deviates, it certainly doesn't adjust to the encompassing wealth of its gameplay. The characters don't develop, they just remain unchanged aside from Horatio, who gets promoted to corpse for emotional impact, despite being largely absent from the bulk of the other content to account for the fact that much of it can be done before or after this point, immediately cheapening that. Watch Dogs 2 in essence is a good idea, but one that only offers the illusion of execution on its narrative front. That can't cheapen a highly immersive world filled with limitless interactions. It can't weaken the generally fun gameplay loop that is a staple of the series, but it can make it quite a forgettable story, and ultimately that's what Watch Dogs 2 was. A game that didn't want to be its predecessor more than it wanted to be what it was striving for. A game with an identity crisis scrambling to define the series by being but a response to criticisms of the game that came before. Watch Dogs 2 feared digging deeper, hitting harder and showing some grit, because all those were things the first game caught strays from critics on. But ultimately, it needed to retain a tinge of that to give weight to itself, to bring its excellent world delivery full circle. Watch Dogs 2 isn't a bad game. It's a bloody good one. It's fun and San Francisco is vibrant and alive, but it's half the game it could have been, and that's perhaps what makes it most frustrating. It's certainly the ultimate source of disjointedness. The gameplay supports a more layered narrative that isn't present. It stumbles into a good idea but was too shy to explore it properly. As a result, we're left with a story that ultimately feels facetious, making dick jokes in the face of high stakes, never addressing the potential for carnage, not taking itself seriously enough to truly make an impact as a substitute for a commentary the game carries, but is too cautious of past criticisms to adequately explore. Watch Dogs 2 deserved a bit better than that. It deserved a multi-dimensional approach. What it does is commendable if a bit over the top, with its overuse of sanitized, outdated memes, but ultimately it's obstructed by what I feel it wants to do, but otherwise can't because it's too busy making a statement on simply not being Watch Dogs 1. But can I recommend this game at all? Say it's fun? Well, yes, because it is fun. It is a good game. You can see why people claim it's the best in the series. I frankly disagree with that, but I don't think the Watch Dogs 2 is the worst in the series by a long shot. And when the time's right, I'm sure I'll get around to doing a video on that one too. But look, I'm going to end today's video here. I'd like to thank you all for watching. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, be sure to go ahead, leave a like, subscribe, maybe share the channel with your friends and all that wonderful stuff. It would be massively appreciated. Perhaps pop me a follow on some social media as well, if that's your thing, of course. I'm not in the habit of forcing people to do things, so if you don't want to, fair enough. And with any luck, I'll be seeing you all very soon with another video at some point. But until next time, take care and goodbye.